So just a few moments ago, the council member had talked a little about homelessness. And just a few days ago, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal a piece by Katie Honan and Corinne Ramey about the fact that the city was purchasing a number of new sites and plants. So in its effort to start closing cluster housing by 2021, there's more than 60,000 homeless living in shelters, and that's been an increase of more than 10,000 people since 2014. And one of the statistics I also had read about was just during the 2017-18 school year, there were about 48,000 students who were living in shelters, and 114,000 public students identified as homeless. And that's up by 66% just in the last 8 years. With that, I'd like to bring on my next guest, Áine Duggan, who's president and CEO of the Partnership for the Homeless. She joined the partnership earlier this year after having an extensive background in nonprofit management. She previously served with Community Resource Exchange as the CEO of two nonprofits and as vice president for the food bank for New York City. Welcome to City Watch.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So first of all, give our listeners a brief overview of the Partnership for the Homeless and the organization's history.
So the partnership has existed for approximately 37 years and has worked on homelessness since the 80s, originally working with a lot of the churches to provide shelter for individuals who were living on the street. And it has morphed and evolved over the last 3 decades, really matching sort of what's happening in homelessness in the city. So today when you look at our services, what you see is that we are mostly serving families with young children. I would say that approximately 80% of our clients are in families, and we provide housing, we provide eviction prevention, we provide support services, and one of the big areas that we focus on is access to education, making sure that children in the shelter system continue to have access to their local schools while they're going through the trauma of homelessness.
And what are you seeing as far as the scope of the homeless population in the city over the last few years? I mean, I noted some statistics, but beyond the statistics, it's the reality, it's the people. What have you been witnessing?
Well, it's actually been very interesting to come into this role, having worked with another homeless organization more than 15 years ago. And at that stage, the record high of homelessness when I left the arena 15 years ago was 39,000. And at the time, I remember we thought that was a staggering number. And to come back into this field and find that it's actually 60,000 people in the shelter system, I think speaks volumes about the way the crisis has been handled in recent years. And again, to bring the focus back to children, the person who's most likely to be in a homeless shelter in New York tonight is a young child. 22,000 of the 60,000 are children, the vast majority of whom are under the age of 6.
And what are some of the challenges that the homeless youth face? Because, it's not just a matter of finding a place, a bed for the night. What are some of the other challenges?
So, the main challenge, just to sort of get it out of the way, but also to be very, very clear about this issue, homelessness is a housing crisis. And I think that's been said by a number of advocates and elected officials and community leaders around the city for years now. But it is a housing crisis, and the number one solution to it is the creation of affordable housing. So I just say that as a backdrop to the rest of the sort of items that we will cover. And that is why, by the way, the partnership supports the House Our Future campaign, and why most of the homeless organizations and many nonprofits around the city have consolidated around the House Our Future campaign, calling on the city to earmark 10% of its new housing plan for affordable units for families and individuals in shelter. But then in terms of the schools piece, what's happening is you have families being placed into shelter when they become homeless. And you could have, for example, we work with a lot of families in the East New York area of Brooklyn. So you could have a family that's placed in a shelter in the Bronx or the far reaches of Queens. And you can imagine the transportation to the school of origin for that family. So they could be looking at a commute of an hour and a half, possibly longer. And then you may have a parent who's working, and sort of arranging the logistics of that each morning become onerous. And on top of that, many of the families don't realize that they have the right to keep their child in their original school. And so what we end up seeing is that many of the children miss weeks, sometimes more than a month of school, and they start to fall behind and do far worse in state exams than their house counterparts, which is essentially setting them up for future poverty and future homelessness themselves.
So we're looking at housing, transportation, education. Is the city doing enough to knit them together to assist those who find themselves without a home?
Well, there's certainly a lot of good efforts that are happening in the city. You know, there's definitely a lot better coordination between the Department of Homeless Services and the Department of Education with respect to, you know, making sure that children have access to schools. So, for example, it was the case that less than 50% of children were being placed in shelters in their borough of origin. And now that number, not immediately, but through transfers that happen in the system, that number is now up to 75%, which is great. And also, 25% of these 22,000 children not being placed in their borough of origin and not having ready access to their schools continues to be a problem, because what you're essentially looking at there is, you know, more than 5,000 children in the shelter system who are not getting ready access to their schools. And that continues to be a huge problem. But, you know, to be fair to the city, one of the key answers to that question is the availability of shelters in the communities from which these children are from. So if we want children to be placed in shelters near their schools, that requires there to be shelters near their schools. And one of the big issues we're facing, and I think one of the big philosophical questions for us as a society in the city at the moment, is some of the activity and some of the rhetoric that's been happening around the placement of shelters in communities.
And additionally, I mean, as we're going through the budget dance right now with the mayor and the city council, you know, I had read that the mayor's $92 billion budget was cutting about $14 million to pay for social workers to help homeless kids get to school. Is that something you're advocating to be able to have that money restored? And what other areas are you seeking, you know, an increase or a return of funds in the budget?
Right. So in the fiscal 19 budget, there was just shy of $14 million for the Bridging the Gap program, which is essentially the program that funds social workers for schools that have high numbers of children living in the shelters. And it's not in the preliminary budget. You know, the thing is, this is part of the budget dance. It wasn't in the preliminary budget last year either, or the year before, and it was restored after an amount of advocacy by various different community groups and leaders. We shouldn't have to fight for this money. You know, it should be baselined in the budget, and not only that, it should be increased, because while the service that exists is great, there is a dearth of social workers for a number of the schools with high numbers of children who are in the shelter system and living doubled up. So we do need to see that budget amount increased, and not only for providing social workers in the schools, but also making sure that there's more DOE resources in the path, which is the entry point for families into the homeless shelter system. Right now, there are less than a handful of DOE workers, and none at the weekends and in the evenings. And unfortunately, homelessness doesn't restrict itself to 9 to 5. And so we do need to see more DOE workers and more outreach in general for families who are going into the shelter system, because you can imagine that when a family enters the shelter system, you know, they're probably experiencing the most destabilizing moment in their lives. And thinking about the school system and thinking about access to school is not the first thing that's on their mind. So we do need to have resources at the path that will ensure that the families have the information and resources that they need for their kids, and making sure that the kids stay in school.
So you've been listening to me, Jeff Simmons, here on City Watch WBAI, New York 99.5 FM, and streaming live at WBAI.org. I'm on with my guest, Áine Duggan, President and CEO of the Partnership for the Homeless. Áine, let's get a little more specific as far as where the partnership steps in. If people need resources, give us a few concrete examples of what the partnership provides to assist people.
So I would say the main service that families come to us for is housing. And so there are two ways we work with them. One is either on eviction prevention. So we're providing them with financial assistance. We provide them with access to legal resources and mediation so that they, if they're going into court and fighting eviction prevention, that they can stay in their homes. Because that is the single best way to address homelessness is to keep people in their homes. So that's one area. The second area then is housing placement, where we work with a number of shelters across the city and with families who are referred to us to help them apply for housing vouchers and to help them find apartments. Now, that's a critical area of work because it can be very difficult for families and individuals on their own to find a landlord that will accept a voucher. It's definitely a piece that's getting better in the city, but there is still a lot of discrimination, and I would say that there are probably a lot of landlords that are still a bit shy about taking housing vouchers, either because they've had a bad experience in the past or because they don't know much about the program. So we do a lot of work with landlords. We do direct outreach to landlords to educate them about the voucher program and to build up a bank of housing for the families that come to us. And then on top of the housing areas, we do a lot of work on health supports for families and individuals. For example, we have a HIV support program where we're making sure that people have access to the medical assistance that they need and stay on their medical regimens. And then I think one of the key pieces of work that we do is building connections for families in the community, particularly families who are being rehoused. Because what we find is that families who are integrated into the community are more likely to stay in permanent housing than families who don't have those supports around them.
And I had also seen on your website that you provide training services or skills building. What's that about?
So there's a number of ways that we do that, particularly in our support groups. So we have support groups that work with women, support groups that work with individuals who are living with HIV. We have a client advisory group, and it's either a case of sort of directly connecting people to employment training services, or we're working with people to sort of develop their own voices and become leaders in the community so that they can access other resources for themselves or other individuals. And what we see through our East New York Center is that the families themselves have become very connected. And so often it is families who've been through the homeless shelter system that continue to work with us, who are turning around and helping families who are newly going through the system find resources and connections in the community once they're placed back in housing. So there is a real sense of community at our Brooklyn location.
And you briefly touched on this before, and I want to go back to it, about the challenges of also proposing and opening a homeless shelter in a community. And over the years, I've witnessed a number of communities that have expressed significant concern that there was no community involvement before locations were selected. What does it take now to be able to choose a location that the community will agree, is a right location that the city wants? What are the factors that should come into play?
Well, I think that the first place we need to start is a conversation centered on integrity, because much of what we're seeing in the dialogue around the community placement of shelters is not, it doesn't really stand up under scrutiny. So there is a lot of outreach that happens in terms of DHS meeting with communities and meeting with elected officials that represent communities to talk about the placement of shelter. And at the same time, even though that's happening, very often when we get to these town halls or community board meetings, there's a denial that outreach has happened. So that piece is a little confusing, and definitely begs more open conversation about why there isn't a full representation of facts at some of the community meetings that happen. But I think even maybe more important than that is when you look at some of the other solutions to homelessness. So whether it's the creation of new housing as per the House Our Future campaign, or whether it's calling for stronger rent subsidies via the Home Stability Support program at the state level, or improved rent regulations, or even the schools access piece that I mentioned, they all do come with a price tag. No doubt about it, they come with a price tag. I think it's a wise investment, but it is a price tag. But when it comes to the community placement of shelter and combating the biggest issue that we're facing there is no price tag. It's something we could all turn around and do tomorrow. And it's also something that every individual, every New Yorker has the ability to do. When faced with a problem like homelessness, it can often feel daunting, and you might think as a regular New Yorker, well, what can I do about it? But with the community placement of shelter, the biggest obstacle we're facing is the not in my backyard sort of attitude about the placement of shelter. And what we've witnessed is that there's been a tremendous amount of vitriol and very negative speech about families and individuals who find themselves needing to rely on the support of the shelter system at some point in their lives. And I think that we do need to change those community conversations, because the people who need community placement of shelter are members of the very communities that we're talking about, right? So that, it is important that the leaders, the city council members and other elected officials who represent these communities be leading the charge on making sure the communities understand that shelters are for their own neighbours, and that all of their constituents are important. And I would call on any individual who lives in an area where there's a shelter, about to be placed, to attend these meetings and to talk about the need for all individuals to be safely housed and all individuals to have access to safe shelter so that their kids can stay in school.
We've got about a minute left. Can you just let our listeners know how people can learn more about the Partnership for the Homeless?
Sure. So the website is partnershipforthehomeless.org, and anybody can contact the partnership at info@pfth, just by emailing info@pfth.org, and then you can call us directly at 212-645-3444.
Áine Duggan, President and CEO of the Partnership for the Homeless, thank you so much for joining me here on WBAI.
Thank you, Jeff.